before I get to audience questions, I want us to say we had to talk about something uplifting and positive and light. Or do you like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion's WAP?
That was such an amazing segue. Let's go upbeat. What are your views on a wet ass pussy?
Doing the most, or else we'll go crazy. Maybe Michelle and Barack can come save me. Spinning around, I need some therapy that's free. Look to my phone as soon as I wake up, lose a patrol. But neither will save us getting it wrong. But at least we try. We try. I really, really like it when you say my name, Black Frasier. I really, really like it when you say those things. Tell me something good. I really, really like it when you say my name, Black Frasier. I really, really like it when you say those things. Tell me something good.
Are you guys? That good?
That was a long one.
Yes. It was a long and weary one because we are going through it.
We are.
The nation, the world, we are going through it. But I am excited for today's episode of Black Frasier. As always, I'm joined by my co-producer, my editor. I'm gonna say serving us 90s grunge realness with this hair, lead singer of Bush.
Was it Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible 2?
You're not there yet.
Oh, dragged.
You'll get there. You are Gavin Rossdale after he cheated on Gwen Stefani and realized how he fucked all the way up with that decision. Team Gwen.
Just let me know when I'm at the Tom Cruise level.
I will say 2021.
Oh shit!
Like spring of 2021. It's the first quarter of 2021.
Do you reckon he was wearing a wig or like extensions for that movie?
No, I mean he was like in his late 30s. I think that was all his hair. He just grew it out, you know. But you're getting there, so I don't want you to feel like you're not. But yeah, this episode is, I don't know, I feel a little. My heart is heavy.
There's been a lot going on.
Yeah, it's just, with Chadwick Boseman passing, so horrific. Rest in power to him, and our hearts go out to his family and his wife, because that is, and all his friends and people who loved him. So it's like that, and then a shooting happened in Portland, and then Jacob Blake in Wisconsin. So it is just feeling like it is hard to just be happy right now.
This dumpster fire is fully lit now.
Yeah, it is fully lit. But I feel like with today's episode, actually, I feel a sense of hope by the end of it. I was like, okay, the conversations I'm having with these people today are like lifting me up, and I hope that they will lift everyone else up.
For sure. And I think I learned a lot not being from America to start with, and then the conversations we're having, I'm learning a lot.
Yeah.
And a lot about US law, that's for sure, which I think is really important during these times.
Yeah, because you didn't really know much about American culture.
I knew obviously what the media portrays, and that's what gets carried over into other countries, I feel.
Right.
But
so you knew like Vanilla Ice.
Sure.
Yikes. That's a bad export.
Duty free.
Oh God. Were you aware of Wu-Tang Clan?
Of course. Yeah.
Okay.
There was this one shop in Boscombe, which is very close to Bournemouth.
Where is it? What's it called?
Boscombe.
Yeah. Okay.
And there was the one shop there that sold like Wu-Tang Clan merch and other like rap culture.
Yeah.
Like merch, and that's where I'd always buy my like dragon shirts, because they were really in when I was a teenager, and my baggy pants from, and my studded belt, of course.
You had a studded belt?
It was red and black as well.
What? How come I haven't seen pictures of this yet?
Because no one needs to.
Can you believe that I've sat on that D and didn't know about this studded belt? Is that too far, babe?
Yeah. Again. I mean, the intro has gotten better. We just need to work on the actual full content now.
Okay, can you just let me live?
Of course.
Thank you. Anyway, let's just bring it back. How can we segue back?
I think we're too far along now, but I think we should bring it back to today's episode.
Yes, today's episode, for everyone listening, you know, what's great about this podcast is that we can have really fun conversations and be jokey and laugh a lot, like with Whitney and with Jamila. And even with Tracy, like just have those moments of levity. But I felt like with everything that's going on in the world and the state of the nation, I really wanted to have a conversation about police brutality and about qualified immunity and also a little bit about the election. So I called on two of the smartest people that I know, MSNBC's Chris Hayes. What a dream machine. You know him from his show on MSNBC, All In with Chris Hayes. His book, A Colony Within a Nation, or A Colony in a Nation, excuse me, which is fantastic and really sort of broke down a lot of how the police works in America that I didn't know about. And then our other guest is Clark Neily, who is a lawyer that I was recently introduced to. I think when I started doing IG Lives and someone DM'd me and they're like, you should talk to Clark. He's a phenomenal lawyer. He's really smart. We spoke specifically about qualified immunity and just the legal system in general, which I was like, oh my gosh, it was so fascinating.
It's so unjust. That's what my mind is just blown by after these conversations.
Yeah. So I think listening to these two conversations, while it is talking about heavy stuff, I do think it's going to motivate a lot of people to get more active in their communities, really be even more impassioned than they already are, and to have more of these conversations and just realize that if every person does one thing, we really can sort of dismantle the systems that are in place. It's going to be really hard. There's going to be a lot of violence that will happen, but it made me feel like we shouldn't give up.
Right.
So I'm really excited to kick off these. And this is like a supersized episode of Black Frasier. This is, this is huge. This is like when you go to the grocery store and you get like bonus size of Ritz crackers. It's 8 sleeves instead of 6. And you're like, what?
Family pack of Cheez-Its. Yeah.
So we're going to kick this off with the first guest, Clark Neily. Hi, Clark.
Hello.
So nice to meet you. I'm really excited that you're going to do the podcast.
Well, thanks so much. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I can't wait. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, good. So yeah, I mean, I guess I want to dive right in because we have so much to talk about. And, the country is a mess. I think we can all agree. And everything that's going on with Jacob Blake and Breonna Taylor and just the countless police shootings and deaths and people talking about defunding the police. Like I sort of around the time of George Floyd, I first started hearing about this term qualified immunity, which I had just never heard before. And I think there are a decent amount of people who are in the same position as me who are like, oh, what does this mean? What's this term? Like, how is this even possible? And so I wanted to, in the conversations that I've been having with people, and especially with Chris about defunding the police, I also felt it was sort of important to really talk about the legal side of things, because I think that is something that so many people are truly in the dark about. Like, what I know about the law is Ally McBeal and like how to get away with murder. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know a lot about the legal system. So first, before we dive into that, I want to sort of get the sort of like origin story for you of how you got into the law. And sort of you can talk specifically about the work that you're doing now. And then we can sort of dive into the conversation about qualified immunity.
Well, thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so glad we're talking about this important issue. So the background is I was a philosophy major who did not want to be a philosopher. Didn't want to spend however many years in grad school. I kind of wanted to have more of engagement in the real world. And I didn't really seriously think about law school when I was in undergraduate. But then after being out for a year and discovering there wasn't a huge market for philosophy and Russian double majors, I decided to take
Wait, that was your double major? Oh, yeah. My gosh.
Yeah. So long story short, I ended up in law school at the University of Texas, which is also where I went to undergrad. And I really loved constitutional law. One of the things I really loved about it the most is that it's essentially, to me at least, the Constitution is a kind of a rule book that effectively tells the government how much of your business they can be in. And I believe that the Constitution was written both with the purpose and ultimately, successfully as a document that says to the government, there's not very much of a citizen's life that is your business. You need to pretty much leave people alone. And I recognize that maybe some of that to a certain extent is my basic libertarian outlook, which is I am a libertarian, but I actually really think that kind of is the point of the Constitution. And so I've just been fascinated kind of my whole life with the question of like, what can we do to stand up to bullies? And I think in this day and age, some of the biggest bullies that we encounter are people who work for the government and presume to be able to involve themselves in our lives and give us orders and do things to us simply because they're from the government and they have the power to do it. And to me, constitutional law and qualified immunity, which is what we're going to be talking about more today, are intimately involved in sort of the question of to what extent can you push back against people from the government, including particularly police officers, when they try to exercise power over you in your life.
Yeah. And so thinking about it now and seeing one of the things that's really tough right now, I think for me, I think for a lot of people, you're seeing just videos constantly, whether it's, a Black person being murdered or a Black person being harassed or just peaceful protesters being harassed and shoved around. And it's really, I think for me, it's definitely making me more fearful of being outside and sort of worrying like, am I going to be under attack in some sort of way that I can't predict at all? And so I think a lot of people are sort of feeling that kind of nervous energy right now. And, on the one hand, while that might feel like a little that might cause anxiety, I'm also wondering if that sort of anxiousness is actually something that, the government or the police wants to encourage in people, because in that way it's easier to keep everyone, quote unquote, in line. What do you think about that?
I think it's possible in some situations, and certainly at periods throughout our history, there's no doubt that that's been what's going on. I hate to paint with too broad a brush. I think it's very important that we don't, sort of just say that just because you're a police officer, you have a particular viewpoint any more than, just because you happen to be a particular color or you're a man or a woman, you have a particular viewpoint. But at the same time, I definitely think that there are certain dysfunctions within the law enforcement institution or culture that are just very difficult to sort of chalk up as kind of just either, sporadic, which is, I think, what a lot of police officers and other members of law enforcement would have us believe, or that are just being overblown, by the media and particularly by social media. And in fact, there's this, I'm on Twitter and I've invented this character on Twitter that I call pro-carceral Twitter, by which I mean, that part of Twitter that thinks there's no real problem with our criminal justice system and thinks that, if anything, our problem is that we don't lock up enough people,
Yeah.
And this kind of imaginary character I've created that I call pro-carceral Twitter, whenever something like this comes up, like the situation we're seeing in Kenosha, Wisconsin, their response is always something along the lines of this: that may have been an abuse of power by that police officer, but you know what the real story is? The real story is that there are hundreds of thousands of encounters between citizens and police officers where police don't shoot them. And I just don't buy that. And then we can get into that a little bit more, but I think that's just a fundamentally mistaken way of looking at the situation. And let's be really frank. If you and I both get pulled over by police officers, you are at greater risk than I am because of the color of your skin. And that is not an irrational fear, no matter what anybody else says. It's just not.
Yeah. And so Look, you said there's some dysfunctions within the police system. Could you maybe name probably a couple that you feel are the most pressing that need to be addressed before anything else can be solved?
Yes, and I think I'd like to talk about two, one of which I think is not their fault, and one of which I think is very much their fault.
Okay.
The one that I think is not their fault is the fact that we pass so many laws that don't have any business being on the books. And here, for example, I'm thinking of drug laws. I oppose all drug laws. I don't think that it is morally defensible to do violence to another human being because of a particular substance that they choose to put in their body. Now, how they behave once they have done that, that's a separate issue. But just putting a particular substance in your body does not hurt anybody else, and it doesn't give the government a legitimate basis to do violence to you by arresting you, by putting you in a cage. So, but we've passed these kinds of laws, and it's not just drug laws, it's other laws like laws against gambling or prostitution, things like that. And then we require police officers to go out into our communities and enforce these laws that are A, not morally justifiable, at least in my judgment, and B, almost certainly do nothing to actually improve the quality of life in those communities or make anybody any safer. And this causes immense conflict, immense tension with the people in those communities, particularly when, as it happens here in America, police tend to focus their enforcement efforts on communities of color and other historically disenfranchised communities. And the people in those communities know that they're being singled out in that way. And it makes them angry, and it should make them angry. So that's point one, is that we send police out into the community to enforce laws that shouldn't be on the books in the first place. And it causes a lot of conflict. The second point, which I do think is the fault of the police, is that they have fought consistently for an extraordinarily low level of accountability in terms of what happens to them when they abuse their power. So you've got members of law enforcement, police and prosecutors, and they hold the rest of us to an extremely high standard of accountability. You can actually be prosecuted, convicted, and incarcerated for committing a crime that you didn't even know was a crime. You had no idea. There's no reason you would have known it was illegal, and they can still, and they do still prosecute you for that. That's a very high level of accountability. But at the same time, when the shoe is on the other foot and a police officer or a prosecutor has done something improper, arguably, they insist on an extraordinarily low level of accountability for themselves. And qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that is the cornerstone of what I call our near zero accountability policy for law enforcement.
Okay, so this is a perfect segue for your brilliant mind to explain to all us listeners what exactly is qualified immunity and how we can go about sort of dismantling this so that justice can actually be served.
Right. Let's take an example that's very common, and I'm sure everybody's heard of it. Racial profiling, otherwise known as driving while black. It happens all the time. In fact, Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina has told the story many times about how he's been pulled over frequently just for driving a car that, is apparently too nice in the eyes of some police officers in South Carolina for a black man to be driving. So he's been pulled over in this car. All right. So racial profiling, it's illegal. In fact, if you do it intentionally as a police officer, it's a crime. So imagine a police officer engages in unconstitutional and illegal racial profiling. What can you do as a citizen to hold that police officer accountable? And there's really only three avenues of accountability here. First is a criminal prosecution of that police officer. Second is some sort of internal accountability mechanism, whether it's being disciplined by their supervisor or having to answer to internal affairs or a citizen review board, something like that. And then third, there's the ability to sue the police officer in a civil rights case. Now, let me take those one at a time really quickly and explain why only the third one, the ability to sue a police officer, is really a viable mechanism for accountability. With respect to criminal prosecutions, the decision whether to prosecute a police officer is out of your hands. You, the victim of the racial profiling, of the illegal racial profiling, do not have the ability to decide whether the police officer is prosecuted for committing that crime. That decision is made by a prosecutor. And guess what? They have a massive conflict of interest. Why? Because they work with police all the time. They depend on police to bring them cases, and they depend on police to testify in those cases in order to get convictions. And if they are on bad terms with the police, it's going to be much more difficult for them to do their jobs. And that's one of the reasons why prosecutors very rarely bring criminal charges against police. So We see it sometimes, usually only when the misconduct has been committed, on video and it's gone viral and there's a lot of pressure on the prosecutor. But generally speaking, prosecutors are not going to bring charges against police officers. And so criminal prosecutions are not an effective mechanism for holding police accountable for violating our rights.
Wow.
The second point is pretty much the same as the first. Internal accountability mechanisms essentially ask the police to decide whether the police did anything wrong. And guess what they almost always say? Nope, we didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah.
So that leaves the third avenue that we talked about, and that is your ability as a citizen to file a civil rights claim against that police officer. That is the only avenue of accountability that you yourself can initiate and pursue without having to persuade anybody who works for the government to go along with it. You can walk into federal court, file a lawsuit against that police officer, and that's the way the system was designed. That is, in fact, supposed to be the primary mechanism of accountability for citizens to hold police accountable. And it's this judicially invented doctrine of qualified immunity that has messed things up.
So to me, hearing that, it feels not that you feel defeated, but it just feels like such an uphill battle, which is, of course, intentional. So we're in this system, and say you want to file a civil suit. I mean, like, would you even have any chance of winning that case? That's what I'm really curious about.
Exactly. Okay, so here's the problem. There's a couple of points here, right? First, I'm a lawyer. I've been a litigator for almost my whole career. And it's a complicated thing to bring a federal lawsuit. Most people don't have the ability to do it. Even most lawyers wouldn't know how to do it. So right off the bat, you've got to find a lawyer who will bring this case on your behalf. Now, there is a small handful of so-called pro bono or public interest lawyers out there who might be willing to take your case for free, but not very many. So in order to be able to bring a case in federal court for a violation of your rights, you either have to have enough money to pay the lawyer out of pocket, which most people don't because good lawyers are expensive, or your case has to be one that the lawyer feels confident enough that they can win, that they will be able to either recover a percentage of the damages that they get. That's called a contingent fee arrangement. Or that if they win the case, they will be able to get an award of attorney's fees. In federal law, there's a provision that says that if you win a civil rights lawsuit against the government has to pay your attorney's fees. They have to pay for the attorney who represented you. I've litigated those kinds of cases, and let me tell you, the government fights really, really hard not to pay attorney's fees, even when they have lost the case and everybody knows that they owe you that money. So you're going to have a pretty rock solid case in order to get a private lawyer to take it. The second major obstacle, and that's the one we've been kind of dancing around a bit, is this legal doctrine called qualified immunity that essentially throws up a major hurdle in your path if you're trying to sue a police officer. And it boils down to this. It's very simple. You cannot sue a police officer for violating your rights unless there is a pre-existing case in that same jurisdiction where some other police officer did essentially the same thing to another person, and the courts have already said that particular thing is impermissible. So in Minnesota, for example, the family of George Floyd, if they bring lawsuit against Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd in front of a bunch of witnesses, in order to succeed in a civil rights claim, they're going to have to find a case in Minnesota where a police officer kneeled on the neck of a person for 9 minutes,
That's
3 minutes after they
horrible.
lost consciousness, failed to render medical attention, and killed them. And if that case isn't on the books, then qualified immunity will apply and that lawsuit will be thrown out of court. That's not an exaggeration. That is actually how it works.
And so do we have any hope of getting rid of qualified immunity? Because it's almost impossible to sort of execute any type of justice when that is in existence.
Exactly right. And the answer is yes. Yes, we do. It is definitely going to be an uphill fight for the following reason. The law enforcement lobby is arguably the second or third strongest in the country. In other words, the law enforcement community is probably the second or third strongest political constituency in the entire country. They have enormous political power and they wield it with a wild abandon. And probably their number one issue is maintaining this very low level of accountability that we talked about. And again, qualified immunity is the cornerstone of this near zero accountability policy. So when you talk about trying to get rid of qualified immunity, what you're talking about is taking away from one of the country's most powerful political constituencies the number one thing that it wants to hold on to. So yes, it will be a huge fight, but the good news is qualified immunity is so unjust. It is so palpably, inexplicably unjust and unfair that you can't defend it. And so this incredible group of people have come together, politicians, activists. There was even a letter that was sent to Congress about 2 months ago from a coalition of professional athletes. More than 1,300 professional athletes sent a letter to Congress talking about qualified immunity and how we should get rid of it. So what's interesting is you've got this incredibly powerful political lobby on the one hand, the law enforcement lobby, but you've got this growing coalition of citizens and public interest groups on the other. And I actually think that in the end, the coalition of citizens and public interest groups is going to end up being stronger than the law enforcement lobby. It doesn't usually happen, but on this one, I think we're going to win.
And so how can, sort of everyday people, like how can we sort of get involved in this? Is it just through local elections and like figuring out who, are the DAs and the prosecutors in your community? Like what are the specific things that we can do to sort of put the pressure on to affect some sort of change?
Imagine that qualified immunity is like a dam that's holding back this giant ocean of justice. We want to let that justice flow out. You don't have to have a stick of dynamite. You don't have to have a sledgehammer to help tear down this dam. If all you've got, is a fork, you can sit there and start scraping away at that thing, because every little bit that we can scrape away, and I'll stop talking metaphorically here, literally just tweeting about it, posting on Instagram about it, Facebook, whatever your social media of choice is. If you want to write a letter to the editor, great. Pick up the phone and call your senator or call your congressman. All you have to say is qualified immunity is an unjust, legal rule that has no business being on the books, and I want you to fight to get rid of it. The more voices that are talking about qualified immunity and talking about getting rid of it, the louder the drumbeat becomes, and it's already pretty loud. And never forget that politicians, one of the things they're more focused on than anything else is getting reelected. Mm-hmm. And when enough people are talking about the same thing and are upset about it, I guarantee you they do start to listen. And we have actually seen that happening. In fact, Colorado last month just passed a law at the state level that creates the ability for citizens to sue police officers for violating their state constitutional rights, which are pretty similar to your federal ones. So like, search and seizure, unreasonable force, and so forth. And they specifically chose to not include qualified. And there is no qualified immunity defense in Colorado to a state level civil rights action. And that didn't happen by accident. It happened because people insisted upon it. And there's other states that have expressed interest in doing the same thing. And this effort is gaining momentum. We should never think that, it's certainly not as if we've already won the game. That is far from true. But if we keep fighting as hard as we have been, there's no question in my mind that qualified immunity is in a very vulnerable place right now. And the more effort and the more we raise our voices and criticize it, the better chance we have of getting rid of it.
Yeah. And so how long have you been a lawyer? How long have you been practicing law?
I've been a lawyer for 20 years and I've been a public interest lawyer for 17 of those.
Wow. So, that is first of all, thank you for doing such important work. I think that's incredible. And so what sort of changes have you seen in the legal system since you started that make you point towards like, okay, there's some actual progress happening. Things are getting better.
Whew. I'm not positive that's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we talk about specific issues, there are certainly areas where things are at least hopefully moving in the right direction. Let me give you one example. I don't know if you've ever heard of another legal doctrine called civil forfeiture, but it's the ability that police have to take your property by simply alleging that it was involved in some kind of a crime, but not proving it.
Wow.
Perfect example is you're driving down the highway. This actually happened here in Virginia where I live. There was a man who owned a barbecue restaurant. I think it was called the Smokin' Rooster. And he was driving to Tennessee because another barbecue restaurant down there had gone out of business and they were auctioning off some of the equipment, and he knew he might, want to buy some of it. So he had about, I want to say $20,000 or $25,000 in cash in his car because that's the easiest way, to do a transaction with somebody you've never met. He got pulled over by the Virginia State Police, asked, and this is a question they now ask routinely, do you have any cash, drugs, or weapons in the car? And if you have cash and you say, yes, I have cash, they'll ask you how much. And if it's too much, and there is no number, this is not a legal thing. If they have what they consider, if you have what they consider to be a suspicious amount of cash, they'll take it. And that's what they did to him. Took it, because what they'll say is, there's no way you would have that much cash unless you got it from some kind of criminal activity like drug dealing. So I'm just going to take it. Yep.
Oh my
And then
God.
the burden shifts to you now that they've taken, and they can take your car, they can take your house, they can take your cash. Once they've taken away your property, the burden shifts to you to jump through all these hoops and hurdles to try to get it back. And it's really complicated. They do it deliberately to make sure that most people don't even try. And that's called civil forfeiture. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry for the government. And it's every bit as unjust and horrible as it sounds like. And guess what? The number of states now that have either completely or at least partially eliminated civil forfeiture is up to, I think, 15. And so that's an area where actually the direction of the law is moving in a very positive direction. Now, is on balance, are we moving in a positive versus negative direction, let's say in criminal justice as a whole? I'm not so sure. But I know that there are some issues where the advocacy that people have done, like we should get rid of civil forfeiture, it has actually worked. So I think qualified immunity is another example that where we could have a similarly positive result. I don't want to be a downer. I don't want to be a pessimist. I've written a piece recently in which I say that, and I present an argument for the proposition that our criminal justice system is in fact rotten to the core. I think it is. I think it is virtually beyond redemption. I'm not sure we can reconstitute it. I mean, I'm not sure we can reform it. I'm afraid we might have to just completely reconstitute it. But that doesn't mean we should give up fighting, and it doesn't mean that there aren't things we can do to improve it. But it is a deeply, deeply pathological system, far more so than I think most people even realize. Well, most people who don't have a lot of firsthand contact with it. The more firsthand contact with it you have, the more you understand how messed up it is.
Wow. So you say it was rotten to the core. And so to reconstitute, like what would the process even be to sort of start from scratch? Because that in a way feels like, well, what's going to happen? We're trying to rebuild the legal system in a way that's going to be, fair and beneficial to the people that it's supposed to sort of protect.
No, you're right. I mean, look, so I think we have to completely overhaul our conception of the police and what their job should be. We have police respond to, anytime. I was just listening to a podcast the other day that involved a former police officer who seemed like actually that his head was in the right place, seemed like a good guy. But he said, when you're a police officer, what you're basically your entire job is you're constantly getting called out to go and try to help people solve problems that have arisen. And I think the reality is that sending a heavily armed agent of the state to resolve kind of any problem that comes up is a really big mistake. Yeah. I think we actually need a well-functioning criminal justice system. I think there are people in the world who are really dangerous and make their communities worse because they hurt people and they steal people's stuff and they make the community a not safe place. But a lot of the issues that arise that we have police become involved with just don't need a police officer, need a mental health specialist or a social worker or something. So I think first and foremost, we need to rethink what we use police for and use them for a lot less. We also need to make it clear that if you want to be a police officer, you are going to be held accountable. And if you abuse, you're going to be clothed with a lot of power and a lot of discretion. And if you abuse it too many times, you are going to be fired. And you are going to have to answer for your conduct. When a citizen sues you in court, you don't get a free pass. You have to go and explain in front of a jury of your peers and that citizen's peers, why you did what you did. And if that doesn't sound like the job for you, then you shouldn't sign up.
Ugh. Can you be in charge of everything? Oh my God. You're so sensible. I wish there were more people like you. So you said you've been working in public interest law for 17 years. I can't even imagine how taxing and intense that is. Can you sort of talk a little bit about like your work and, sort of like what inspires you most when you work in it and what is sort of kind of the most frustrating aspect of your job?
Well, I really appreciate that. Thank you. It means a lot to me to hear that. Actually, what you just said to me is the kind of thing that does help keep me going. I'll share a quick story with you. My father, who I admire tremendously, and is he's a libertarian like I am, but he doesn't really wear it on his sleeve. He just kind of really believes in people, that people should have the maximum sort of space to live their own lives. But his first job out of college in the early 1960s was he went to work for NASA and he helped put a man on the moon.
Wow.
Yeah, and I'm full of admiration. He actually helped train astronauts when he was in his mid-20s. But I'll never forget that he told me something one time. He said, if I have one regret in my life, it's that when people started getting on buses to go south and work on civil rights, and join the Freedom Riders, he said, I wasn't one of those people. I didn't get on that bus, And I said, but you went to NASA, man. You helped put a man on the moon, and it was realizing that my own father, who I think is an amazing person and had this amazing experience where he helped, literally put a man on the moon. Nevertheless, he felt that he should have maybe taken at least some of that time and gone to help with the civil rights, effort. And I wanted to make sure I never had that regret myself.
Yeah.
And when I finally realized, so most of my career as a public interest lawyer, I worked for a public interest law firm called the Institute for Justice that does things like property rights and economic liberty and so forth, but not criminal stuff. And at some point along the way, I realized that, at least from my perception, the number one source of injustice in this country is the criminal justice system. Some people don't even call it the criminal justice system. There are some people who won't even use that term. They call it the criminal legal system because they don't think it merits the word justice.
Yeah.
And when I realized that, I kind of had a similar moment to the one that my dad described to me. And I realized to myself, having now realized what is the biggest source of injustice in this country, I have a duty. I have to go and see if I can help with this. And that was about 3 years ago when I left the Institute for Justice and came over to the Cato Institute, where I work now, and I'm now in charge of the criminal justice program here. And I just, I've been very fortunate in some ways because I have been able to live my life without really having to worry, about getting shot during a traffic stop, for example, or being the target of racially disparate law enforcement efforts. And that doesn't mean that I should therefore, sort of just be entitled to pretend as if everybody else has had the same experience and that, there's not this huge problem out there that needs to be addressed. Now, it's not that the entire problem with our criminal justice system is racially disparate enforcement, but that's a big part of the problem. And I think all of us, regardless of the color of our skin, who have some ability to help try to make that system better and to minimize the amount of injustice that it produces, I think we have an obligation to at least try.
Yeah, and so your work now, what are sort of the main things that you're really focused on now? You're like, these are urgent that we must sort of conquer.
Yeah, so as you may or may not know, so you've probably heard the term mass incarceration. What many people don't know is that we have the highest rate of incarceration of any country in the world. America has about 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prisoners. I find that repugnant.
Yeah.
And it's not by a little bit. We have an incarceration rate that is 4 or 5 times higher than places like Canada or Great Britain or Australia. And I just cannot believe that that's good, that it's necessary, that there's not some other way that we could do better. So for me, I do believe we have a problem both with mass incarceration, meaning I do think we lock up too many people. I also think we have a problem with misincarceration. I think we're locking up the wrong people. Just to give you one really horrifying example, there's a term called clearance rates. And really all it just means is this is when a police department shuts down an investigation because they believe they've caught the person who did it. They've made an arrest. And when a case is cleared, that means they've made an arrest and they believe, and they may or may not be right, but they're going to stop looking for the person. Back in the 1950s, we had a clearance rate for homicides of about 90%. That means in 90% of homicides, the police made an arrest. The clearance rate for homicides in America now is 61%. And
what?
falling. Yes. In America, you have a 40% chance of getting away with murder. And in many big cities, it is well below 50%. And there are actually some neighborhoods in places like Chicago and Baltimore where it's actually close to zero. There's an almost 100% chance that you'll get away with murder. And that's, when you've got, and by the way, it's not just homicide. The clearance rate for violent crimes across the board in America is less than 50%. And for property crimes, it's less than 20%. And nevertheless, there were more arrests for marijuana possession in 2015 through 2017, which is the last year I have data, than for all violent crimes combined.
Wow.
So you got police out there arresting people, for possessing a substance that most Americans think shouldn't even be criminalized.
Yeah.
At the same time that they're systematically failing to catch murderers and rapists and armed robbers. And so that's what I mean when I say we have a misincarceration problem. We're locking up people who shouldn't be in prison, and we're failing to lock up people who probably should. So, I will let me give it to you this way. I think that one way to think about our criminal justice system is, if you've ever seen a wood chipper, this is the big machine they bring to your house, when you have a tree cut down or whatever, and they shove branches in there. I think of our criminal justice system as like being like a giant wood chipper. And basically what it tries to do is process as many people through it as possible. And what comes out the other end of our criminal justice system is not sawdust, but convictions, bodies in cages. And there's a really strong economic incentive within our system to maximize the output of the criminal justice wood chipper. And I think that's a big part of the reason why we lock up so many people. I don't think it's because and there's not some rational, thought process behind like, okay, what would be the optimal number of people to lock up, or, how should we go about it, or whatever. We just have a bunch of people that we've hired to essentially play a role in the arrest, prosecution, and incarceration of human beings. And by and large, their job depends on volume. They do volume. So I think of my job as a criminal justice reformer as trying to think of creative ways to jam up that criminal justice wood chipper and to make it more selective about who we throw into it in the first place. And I'll give you just one example that I spend a lot of time on. The key thing that has to happen before the government can put you in prison is that you have to be convicted of the crime. They can hold you in jail pre-trial, and we do put way too many people in jail before trial. But in order to actually punish you, in order to put you in prison for, 5, 10, 20, 30 years, whatever, they first have to convict you. The constitutionally prescribed process for obtaining a criminal conviction is actually quite complicated. The Bill of Rights devotes more words to the subject of criminal procedure than any other topic. You have a right to an attorney. You have to be confronted with witnesses against you. And you know what the key part of it is? The key part of it is the jury trial. You have a right to a jury trial. And the thing that's interesting about jury trials is they are inefficient. I'll say it again, they're inefficient, but that's not a bug, or that's not a bug, it's a feature. So when you think, and just think about it really in easy terms, imagine that the cost of a felony criminal prosecution that culminates in a jury trial is $100,000. And it's probably actually more than that, but let's say it's $100,000. The government's going to have to really think long and hard about whether it's willing to spend that much money to get that conviction, to lock you up. But what if they could get a conviction for like 10 cents on the dollar or 5 cents on the dollar? Is there some way that they can get they can go from a retail level or an artisanal form of prosecuting people, which is the jury trial? Is there some way they can industrialize it to do it on a mass scale? And guess what? The answer is yes. Jury trials are practically extinct on American soil. I didn't know that before I started doing this work. There are very few criminal cases that go to trial anymore. Why? Because almost all of them end up with a guilty plea. People are pleading guilty to crimes they've been accused of. They're waiving their right to a jury trial and just saying, hey, you know what? You got me. I did it. Can you think of any reason why 95% of all criminal convictions in America today are obtained through guilty pleas? People saying, you know what? I don't want a jury trial. I'll just go ahead and say I did it. Can you think of any reason why? Yeah, that's right. Why on earth would so many people waive their constitutional right to a jury? Because even if you're guilty, you still have a chance of being acquitted, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the key witness doesn't show up. Maybe the government messes up the chain of custody with the drugs. Maybe, they just have a bad day. But nope, almost nobody wants to go to trial anymore. Can you imagine any reason for that?
No. Is it because the people are unreliable? I don't know.
No. Let me give it to you. So, do you remember the Varsity Blues prosecution about the college admission scandal with all those Hollywood celebrities that cheated their kids' way into college?
Yeah.
Do you remember that Felicity Huffman just agreed to plead guilty after holding out for about a year and a half?
Yeah.
Do you know what she got in exchange for pleading guilty?
No.
She got a 2-month prison sentence. 2 months.
My
Do you know what they were threatening her with?
No.
If she went to trial?
What?
20 years. That's how you get convictions in our system. That's how you get people to plead guilty. You threaten them with 20 years and then you offer them 2 months if they will agree to waive their right to a trial and plead guilty instead. But if they don't, if they insist on that right to trial and they lose, you crucify them with a 20-year sentence to make, not just to send them a message, but more importantly, to send everybody else a message that the last thing you want to do in America's criminal justice system is exercise your right to trial, because if you do it and you lose, we are going to make you pay for it. It's called the trial penalty. It actually has a name, the trial penalty. And it's the penalty that the system imposes on you for exercising your right to a jury trial. And the thing that this enables the system to do is to massively increase the number of cases that prosecutors can bring. Why? Because they can be confident that they will not have to go to trial in most of their cases. Most of their cases will just resolve almost immediately as soon as they say, hey, we can do it this way, where you go to prison for 20 years if you go to trial and lose, or we can do it this way, where instead of, all the muss and fuss of a jury trial, you just go ahead and agree to plead guilty and we give you a nice break. Now, the disparities are not always as big as the one that I just described, 2 months versus 20 years, but the disparity, basically, the amount of pressure that prosecutors bring to bear is essentially whatever pressure is necessary to get you to waive your right to a trial and plead guilty. That's how our system operates. And that's the secret sauce to mass incarceration. You couldn't have mass incarceration without coercive plea bargaining. Why? Because we just don't have the resources to prosecute as many people as we do if every single one of those cases had to end in a jury trial the way the Constitution says. So somewhere along about 25, 30 years ago, judges and prosecutors essentially discovered how to effectively industrialize the process of prosecuting and convicting defendants. And that really was the beginning of mass incarceration in America. You can actually look at the, if you had a graph, you can actually look at the line of our incarceration rate. And right around the late 70s, early 80s, it goes like this. And that's basically when prosecutors figured out how to get virtually everybody to waive their right to a trial and just plead guilty. That's, to me, that's really, that is one of the most significant pathologies in our system. And let me repeat, it would be impossible to have mass incarceration without mass plea bargaining.
Yeah, and it makes me think about just, America is so much about punishment, right? Like there is no rehabilitation. It's like you must pay for your crimes. You must pay to the most severe extent. And I think that sort of mentality is, obviously leading to mass incarceration, but it's also sort of, how are we letting down society, right? Like how are we letting down people just across the board, not giving them a chance, not a chance to do better, to learn, to rehabilitate, to be, an active citizen in society. It's so heartbreaking to think about that the legal system has been a part of this sort of negative, horrific crime that's been going on. I don't know.
I couldn't agree more. We have I think we've lost sight of our humanity in some ways. I think most people have no idea just how brutal and savage a prison, sentence is for so many people. I mean, I think about myself. I've got 2 little kids, and the idea that I would go a week without seeing them, let alone a year or 10 years, feels like somebody's sticking a knife in my heart. And if you talk to people, and I'm sure you have, who've been in prison, many of them describe it as a living death. You're cut off from everything, and you're cut off from all your relationships, all of your support, and the people who love you. And then, if that weren't bad enough, you're placed in this horrific environment, which is just, the violence, without exception, the most dangerous places in the world right now are American prisons, where COVID is out of control. And even when we're not in the middle of an epidemic, prisons are horrible places to be. And particularly in federal court, I mean, they hand out decades in prison like it was Halloween candy.
Wow.
And I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think as a country, first of all, it doesn't work. It's not fixing anything. We still have, I mean, the crime rate has come down since the 1990s, but nobody serious. Well, not nobody. Very few serious people think that that's because we've been locking people up, in mass numbers. But more importantly, there's a lot of evidence that the length of a prison sentence does not have much of a deterrent effect at all on people. The thing that deters people from committing crimes is the certainty that they will be caught, not the severity of the punishment. And so that's another part of the tragedy, is that so much of the severity of our punishment it's not doing anything for us, and it's probably making things worse, because once you've been in prison for more than a year or two, the odds of getting your life back together go right through the floor. It's very difficult to come out of prison and have a gainful employment or a meaningful life after even a few years in prison. And it's such a tragedy, because it's so brutal, it's so mindless, it's so inhumane, and on top of everything else, not only is it probably not helping very much, it's probably actually hurting a lot our society. So it's also pointless and inhuman.
Yeah. And so as we're looking at the country now, we have the election coming up, which is, I am truly terrified. And I think a lot of people are. And we're looking towards the future, even beyond, November 3rd. What are you hoping what are you hoping this country changes the most, so we can move in a positive direction when it comes to the police, when it comes to the legal system?
Yeah, let's see if we can find a ray of sunshine
Yeah,
here.
right.
So one of the most encouraging developments for me has been the rise of the so-called progressive prosecutors. And what I'm talking about here are, for example, people who were criminal defense attorneys or public defenders who are running for DA, who are becoming the head prosecutor in various jurisdictions. There's a guy named Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, Kim Fox in Chicago. There's a number of Chesa Boudin in San Francisco. These are people who are running for head prosecutor with the specific intent of dismantling large portions of the system that are the most unjust, and they've been amazingly successful. There's a lot of backlash among the sort of law and order types, which is fine. I think, frankly, if you're not getting some backlash from the law and order community, you're probably not fighting hard enough.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that across the board. I don't mean that to be glib. I don't say that every single thing they're doing is right. But on balance, I think that that most of these progressive prosecutors are getting a lot of things right, like not enforcing victimless crimes like simple drug possession, things like that. So that's one ray of sunshine, is that the people who are kind of mostly in charge of deciding how the levers of the criminal justice system are deployed are changing, and it's also sending a message to other DAs that if they don't want to get voted out of office, then maybe they need to rethink, their approach. Another thing I'd like to see that we haven't really begun to see yet, and I'm hoping that depending how the election goes, maybe we can see more of this, is I think it matters tremendously who serves as judges. The judges are the ones who decide whether to put up with a lot of this stuff, whether to, for example, accept an obviously coerced plea, things like that. I did a report for Cato about 2 years ago. It was actually, I guess it was a year and a half ago, where we tried to test the question of whether it is true that a massively disproportionate number of judges are former prosecutors, as opposed to, for example, former defense attorneys.
Yeah.
And it turns out to be true. The answer is absolutely yes.
Wow.
And then we looked at it a little more broadly and said, okay, well, what about not just prosecutors, but just kind of like anybody whose formative professional experience was serving as a advocate for government in the courtroom, right? And the disproportion is amazing. Basically, if you're looking at people who used to advocate for government versus people like me who used to advocate against government, the ratio is 7-1 on the federal judiciary, right? So just imagine how that affects the development of legal doctrine, of constitutional interpretation, right? You've got a bunch of people who are deciding whether the government has acted unconstitutionally, whose last job before they became a judge was working for the same government.
Yeah.
And so that's something I'd like to see change. I'd like to see the judiciary have something more close to a 50-50 split between people, whose former job was prosecutor versus people whose former job was defense attorney. I think that would change things, for the better in a lot of ways. And I'd also just like to see the energy that we're seeing. there's right now I see in the country there's constructive energy and there's destructive energy. And the destructive energy are the riots and the wanton destruction of property in downtown area. That's not doing anybody any good. But the constructive energy, the positive energy that we're seeing is people demanding change. It's people getting out in the streets and showing solidarity and carrying signs. And I've seen signs, people saying, abolish qualified immunity, things like that. That is positive energy. And in my entire career as a public interest lawyer, I've never seen more energy behind any one issue than I have seen behind criminal justice reform and specifically policing reform that I'm seeing now.
Wow.
The question is, how can we channel that energy into the most constructive direction, I think. And we've certainly got room to improve, but the energy that's available to improve the system is amazing. And I think if all of us can think hard about what we can do personally to help channel that energy in the most constructive direction possible, this may be the single best opportunity we've had in the last couple of generations to achieve real significant reform.
Well, you know what? That end part got me really inspired. So I think you did it. I think you were able to do it. Well, this has been such a great conversation. I feel like I have learned so much. And I think, the people that are listening to this podcast as well, I think you're going to realize, there's so much about the legal system and the process that we just didn't know. And so now that we're armed with more information, we can go out and do better. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about all this stuff. You're an incredible human being. And I hope that, I don't know, maybe in 2072, we can all meet in person. Who knows when we'll be able to get outside of our houses. But thank you so much.
I would love that. And you are an inspiring force for good. You're an amazing interviewer. And I just wish you the best of everything and the best for the podcast. I can't wait to hear your other episodes. You've been so wonderful to talk with.
Oh, thank you. Oh, thank you so much, Clark. Oh my gosh. Bake Off. Was that not?
Heavily depressing, but also very enlightening. Yes. Just to know that the US justice system just needs to be completely thrown out the window and redone.
I think we should, let's come up with a plan.
You and I?
Yeah.
We're going to write the new law.
Yeah, why not? I know how to write. I'm a New York Times bestselling author. And you have that pip voice that people listen to.
People will just believe whatever I say. So.
Yeah. British Bake Off decrees. First thing I'm going to do is change the national anthem to U2's Beautiful Day.
See, this is where it all starts going wrong.
I mean, if we're going to get started, we got to address one of the most pressing issues. And it's that Beautiful Day is not the national anthem. That's my call to action.
This is already turning into quite the dictatorship. Like, there's no vote. It's not open to the people. This is the national anthem. Now get on with it.
But it's a great Nash anthem.
You should just abbreviate that to Nash Anth.
Yeah. Okay, what laws are you working on, mister?
Equal rights for everyone.
Oh.
Dragged.
Okay, well, great. Good for you. I would like to see you do that.
Okay.
And how are you going to make equal...
Give me a week. And I'll come back with a proposal.
Anyway, second interview is with Chris Hayes. I adore him. He's a bud of mine. I always feel terribly stupid when I talk to him about heavy issues because he's so smart, and I feel like we always get real deep.
Mm-hmm.
I think this conversation about police brutality, about the election, about the Joe Biden of it all, and also about what's going on like internationally and how fascism is literally trending like it is
globally.
Yeah, it is insane. So I think it was really great to have this conversation with him, and you guys are going to enjoy it. So without further ado, do you want to introduce it, British Bake Off?
Here is bloody Chris Hayes. That do good.
That was good. Okay, first of all, I just want to say before we get started, I feel like we only ever talk when shit is going down. Like we never like just hang out and catch up. It's always like people are dying, the country's falling apart. What is it about us?
I think it's also that's the steady state equilibrium we've been in for a while, sadly.
Yeah. But hi, Chris.
Hey, Phoebe.
Thanks so much for doing Black Frasier. We had this on the books for a while, but with everything going on in Wisconsin, with Jacob Blake, to me, I'm like, oh, this feels even more timely than it already did. So I'm glad that we could sit down and chat today and talk about police brutality, talk about defunding the police, qualified immunity, all that stuff, because I know a lot of people who've been listening to the podcast want us to discuss these things. So I guess the first question that I want to ask is, Chris, is all hope lost? Like, I just feel like, we have the social uprisings happening and it feels like we're making progress, and then shootings keep happening, and, companies and brands are saying like, we're going to show up for Black Lives Matter. But then, of course, like, all right, well, are they going to show up in the corporate level, or are they going to really show up in the DNA of the company? And then that's unclear. It really feels like, there's one moment where you're excited about Kamala Harris getting the VP nomination, and then it just sort of comes back down to just more violence and death. And I guess for me, I'm an optimistic person, but I'm just feeling like I don't even know if I can have hope or like believe in hope the way that I did back in 2008. So I'm wondering, like, what are you thinking? Where's your headspace right now?
I definitely have been to some dark places, I would say. I'm generally a fairly optimistic person. I think that, I think hope is a practice that you hope is born of will, and not because you're making a rational assessment that things will get better.
Yeah.
So those two things are different, like hope is about a willful exertion to imagine a better world and do what you can to bring it into being. And I think what you're expressing, if I'm not mistaken, because I've felt it too, and a lot of people, is just the exhaustion that comes with that mental exertion, that soul exertion. Like, to hope is to exert, is to commit, is to put yourself into something. And there's lots of times where it feels like it's unrewarded.
Yeah.
And I think, in the case of I sort of had the same feeling of watching the Jacob Blake video of like, I know how this is happening. I know, like, yes, this is what happens in America, but also this, like, how is this happening? How is this happening right now? And I think also there's a degree to which, I think I've said this, I maybe even said it before to you once, that like, social progress is not linear. It's not like painting a fence. It's not like the little download bar when you like download a file and it just like goes through and you're like, okay, well, we're 80% of the way there. Yeah. Now we're 90%. Like, that's not how it works. It goes back and forth, and things can be stuck for a very long time, and then like a stuck lid on a jar, they pop off.
Yeah.
And I think you have to kind of keep reminding yourself of that, because if you're tracking it in a linear fashion, it certainly doesn't feel. It can be really depressing. So I think there's like actual rational reasons, as someone who spends my life, tracking American politics and American society, that like things have moved in the right direction in many ways.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of reasons to worry, and one of the lessons of history. American history is like, there's no progress without backlash. Like, there's no final victory. No one gets to like plant the flag and be like, we're done, we're good, it's cool. It doesn't really happen. Like, everything is contested all the time. Every victory has to be fought for and expanded. And so anytime that you like, and that's exhausting, because if you think to yourself like, oh, okay, we just got to defeat Donald Trump, and it's like, then there could be a lot more battles. Like, they never end. That's the nature of things, and I think that can be overwhelming.
Yeah, and so, you said you watched the tape of Jacob, and I couldn't watch it. I think I stopped maybe a couple years ago watching these videos because I just felt like it was too mentally traumatizing for me. And so I think the big thing that I'm thinking about when it comes to these videos is to me, it seems as though these videos must exist in order for and be viewed and go viral on social media in order for non-Black people to actually believe that Black people are being hunted by the police. And I wonder, to me, I just feel like it's so damaging because if that is the imagery that you're constantly seeing a dehumanization of Black people. I am wondering if that is even useful at this point, because it's not as though these videos come out, like you look at Eric Garner, you look at all these people, no justice has really been served. You know what I mean? Like no one's really gone in trial. No one certainly has been put in jail for committing these acts of violence and crimes and murder. And so to me, I'm wondering, like, is this even what we should be doing as a society right now? Like, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
land?
It's a good, profound question. I never share those videos on social media. I try not to. I think the way that I think about them in a news capacity has changed, where like, if you're doing a news story, you kind of have to play the video, but but that said, like, and I think we've actually gotten a little better about this, about like, don't use it as B-roll. Don't just like run it as wallpaper. Like you set it up, you say, this is a really disturbing thing. This is the center of the news. Take a look at what happened. And then you're not like using it as just this like visual, because I agree with I don't know, man. It's a tough question. It's a little different. I think it's just like a person on social media as opposed to like a news anchor. Cause like we show videos all the time. And like, I remember having these battles over ISIS stuff. Yeah. These were fights we had about ISIS videos that were made to be propaganda. They were evil, torturous, disgusting, dehumanizing videos, slickly produced for the purpose of being disseminated. At the same time, it's like, they killed an American hostage. That's the news story. There's a video of it. Like, it feels weird not to show it when you have a TV show. And I remember I never came to some sort of settled ethical view on it because it was really hard. And I think we're in a similar place now. I mean, obviously this isn't being created as propaganda in the same way ISIS was, but there's something deeply dehumanizing, and the repetition of those dehumanizing images, I think we have to take seriously about what it means on the other side. I mean, I do think that the images have changed American consciousness, so I don't think it has been for naught. I also think there's a degree to which like the family's wishes matter a lot. Yeah. Like I think that in cases of family members being like, please don't show this video, we should respect that. Yeah. But I don't know. I hear and empathize and don't disagree with your exhaustion that at a certain point it feels like snuff porn. Like it's like there's something just dark and messed up about it. Like, and it's doing something dark to us to watch this happen over and over again. There's something, we're somehow being implicated and we're somehow being desensitized and we're somehow participants in the dehumanization, in the ritual we now have of the video and the dissemination of it.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, like, what steps do we have to take where these videos don't have to be shown and there will still be this sort of energy of making sure that these cops are arrested? Because there's always like the leave of absence and like you get sent home and you turn your gun and badge like this is NYPD Blue, but then it's like these are actual literal lives being murdered and taken away, and it's like unless these videos are shown, literally nothing will happen to the police officers. So I'm wondering, like, to me it feels like we're in a police state. Like I just feel like we are. I just feel like the police can pretty much get away with almost anything. And I think a lot of people feel that way. Certainly a lot of brown and black people feel that way. And so to me, I'm wondering, like, I think we just really have to, and maybe this is just me just sort of not really completely understanding everything, but I really do think we have to push towards defunding the police, because at this point, I don't really understand the purpose of them in communities, because Jacob was breaking up a fight and going back to his car to take his kids home, and he was shot 7 times in the back. Like that was clearly just like, I think I could get away with shooting a black person, so I'm just going to fucking go for it. And that's not like one bad apple. That's, I think is,
I mean, I hear you on that. I mean, I'm very sympathetic to views on defunding the police. I think the way that I try to think about it is like, I think my kind of somewhat compromised synthesis is like reduce the scope of policing.
Mm-hmm.
That I think there's a role for policing, but its scope has to be greatly reduced. And reducing the scope would go a long way towards solving some of these problems. There's some people who say, look, the thing can't be, you just have to get rid of it. The question about, there's also this question of accountability, which feels like I think part of the reason people have gone to defund the police, rightly, is that there's just a sense that like there is nothing to be done to fix the accountability problem. Like it's just there's something just deeply broken about it. Mm-hmm. It's broken at a legal level. It's broken at a cultural level. It's broken at a sort of institutional level in terms of police unions. Like this feeling, like I mean, the moment that really hit this home for me, and there's a million moments like this, but. Mm-hmm. When the 2 cops that shoved the old man on the streets of Buffalo, put him in the hospital, I think fractured his skull, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. Very serious injuries. He was in the ICU. He's a 70-something-year-old peace protester who's like constantly at these protests, right? He walks up to them, they shove him on the ground, and they start walking past him. At first, the cops lied about what happened in their statement, which they do all the time. Then 2 of the cops got disciplined, and I think maybe even criminally charged. I forget if it was internally charged. When they got out of either their charging, I think they were charged. When they walked out, there's crowds of police cheering them.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't know, man, if that's what the culture is, I don't know what to say. Like there's just something about that just feels so deeply broken. Now, to play devil's advocate on the other side, I think the thing that we want security, safety, freedom, respect, and dignity, right? We want neighborhoods that are where people go about their lives as free people. They're afforded respect and dignity and their rights as citizens by the state. And people are also free and secure. And, and the violence that we have is a real problem. We've seen the explosion of violence in a lot of the major cities. And when you talk to defund the police people, they rightly point out that like it's not just defund the police. You have to create institutions and civic networks and fund interventions that address violence and safety. And I am a little worried that what we've ended up in is a situation where police have gone on a kind of quasi blue flu strike in a lot of places. They're like, oh, you don't want us? You don't need us? Okay. But there's nothing else filling the vacuum. There's no increase in investments in those neighborhoods. There's no more people aren't funding groups like Cure Violence or violence interrupters or different kind of interventions that are non-police that we have seen work in places. That's not flooding into the vacuum. And so I think the result of that in some places, we're seeing a lot more violence.
Well, I guess, for me, thinking about defunding the police and sort of the resistance that I find so interesting is that people aren't people who are anti-defunding the police, right? So you say one, defund it and then reallocate those funds to social workers and blah, blah, blah. Like people aren't as excited about that notion, right? Like because maybe that's not as sexy as sort of toppling this institution, right? And that requires actually more work to make sure we're supporting social workers and make sure we have, like you're saying, these different institutions that are trying to monitor violence in their neighborhoods. And so I'm wondering if people who are pro defunding the police are maybe sort of, they're excited about that, but they're not they're not understanding that that's also going to require XYZ amount of work, the same way that like you vote is like the beginning of it. And then for those 4 years, you have to make sure your local politicians are staying on top of their tasks.
I mean, that I think that's a really well said and a good analogy. I mean, I think there are people who advocate defunding police who are very serious about that. But you know, look, you know, just society creates building institutions as much as tearing down bad ones. Mm-hmm. You know, and like, you know, we've seen that. I mean, to me, the iconic version of that was the Project of Reconstruction, which is one institution was destroyed, rightly, slavery. If you just destroyed slavery and you did nothing, which is what a lot of white politicians at the time were advocating for, like, we've done it, done our job, we're out.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's not going to work. Like, you can't enslave people for several centuries and then be like, okay, we're done. Go, good luck, I guess. Like, the whole project, you know, the idea of 40 acres and a mule, and then the Freedmen's Bureau and Reconstruction and the schools that were set up in the South and the programs of political involvement and the sort of institutions to create the baseline for sort of social cohesion and justice, like redistributive justice. The absence of a thing isn't enough. Like, you have to build things. And in some ways, like, the things that got built during that period were pretty remarkable. Yeah. And then they were torn down and destroyed. And the vacuum was sort of left, into which came, you know, Jim Crow. But it's like, abolishing slavery wasn't enough. Like, getting rid of bad things isn't enough. You have to build institutions that deliver for people. Like, whether that and speak to their very real concerns. And I think, you know, the polling on this is interesting. Like, you know, it's very, very, very generationally skewed. You know, African Americans over a certain age, by pretty large numbers, opposed to funding the police. White people below a certain age are much more open to it. So I think there's a real sort of generational thing. But I think the point is that, like, you have to speak to people's desire for things like personal security and safety. You have to engage with it. Yeah. You can't say to people, like, I'm sorry. I mean, you can say whatever you want. But if you're trying to sort of, you know, move things in a certain direction politically, like, listening to where people are coming from and meeting them there is really important for this discussion. I think a lot of the organizers and activists and educators doing this work have been doing that. But look, I think it's so crazy to me that the militancy and hardlineness of police is really something to marvel at over the last 2 months.
Yeah.
I mean, just like this idea of, like, no. Like,
we're heroes.
We're all that stands
us.
Between you and we're being persecuted, and, you know, video after video after video of just, like, beating people up, shoving, like, treating them with disrespect, like, and it's like, no, that's what I'm entitled to do because it's my job.
Yeah, and so I want to talk about the RNC because I watched like an hour of it last night and I had to turn it off because it was truly too wild. First of all, I was like, where do they find all these Black people to show up and speak at this thing, number one. But number two, it was very much leaning into, not only revisionist history, but also president of, you know, law and order. Like, that was a theme that was repeated throughout. And, you know, using kind of like coded language such as like radicals or, you know, Marxist in your neighborhoods. Like, we all know wink, that's people of color. Wink, that's people who are lower income based. And that, to me, just the music and the video packages, like, it was painting such a picture. If you don't have police, if you do not arm yourself with guns, if you do not stand on your lawn aiming your gun at people, you will die. This country will fall apart. And so I'm wondering, like, how that is, for people who are truly watching that and believing that, it is almost impossible to break through that, right? Because, who's going to be anti their own safety, right? Who's going to not want to protect their families?
Yeah.
Like, and so I'm wondering, like, how can we push up against that if, you know, the right is sort of pushing this, like, if you don't have police, your neighborhoods will fall apart.
Yeah, I mean, it's a powerful. I think the messenger right now is pretty debilitated in Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and I think the fact that he's an incumbent lessens it. But like, no one should ever underestimate the power of those appeals. I mean, like, you know, to white folks particularly, but not just white people. Like, you know, we have very pretty good data from social psychologists and political scientists that when people are scared, they get more reactionary. Like, particularly if they're scared of physical violence.
Yeah.
I think we saw that. I mean, in my own political experience, like 9/11 was like, I didn't need an experiment after that. Like 9/11 happened. It was horrifyingly traumatic and terrifying. Like,
yeah,
legitimately horrifying and terrifying, and not like some like concocted, like you're scared about some crazy thing. Like, that happened.
Yeah.
And people got scared and they got real right wing. Like, people said some like liberals saying crazy ass shit.
Yeah.
Oh,
like what?
A day
like
later,
what?
like, let's bring back torture. Like, a day later. Who's in for torture? Like, what? Oh, like, I mean, just people saying crazy stuff. And it's like, so I do think that, like, they're not wrong to understand that the thing that they're trying to exploit is a specific kind of white fear of your personal safety and security. And to be totally honest, if you say, like, how to work against that, there's two questions. Like, what would I tell Joe Biden to say, or what should activists be saying? Because it's like, Joe Biden, if you hired me just to, you know, counsel Joe Biden, I would definitely counsel him to not run on defunding the police. Like, I would tell him he should run on, as a political matter, in terms of the votes you need to get, I would tell him, like, you should run on reforming the police. You should run on police accountability. Everyone deserves just and constitutional policing. Police need to be, you know, but like, I think it would probably be politically difficult for him to run as that. I think it would probably hurt him a few points.
Yeah.
And I think that the point is that, like, one of the things I think we're seeing is a good analogy, I think, is gay marriage equality. Like, there was a arguments being made that if you let this happen, everything falls apart.
Yeah. That
was the argument. The family, the household, Western civilization will all come crumbling down. This institution of marriage is so sacrosanct and it's so central. If you start mucking with it, forget it. It all comes down. And part of the project of activists was to show that wasn't the case, but also to find places. That's why, like, having it in certain places, and it was like, oh, this has not ushered in Gomorrah. Yeah. Everyone's still standing. Like, I think that's also true at the local level, like having places that are working to reduce the scope of policing, that are reducing, like, that are actually implementing it to then take a real life example and be like, look, it didn't fall apart.
Yeah. But I do understand politically, like, to have Joe run on a platform that probably makes sense. But I guess my question would be, is reforming the police possible? Like, it's really hard.
I'm not telling. I'm not saying that that's like the right policy. I'm saying if you just like want to give a message that will win you the number of voters you need in the key electoral college states, I think that is probably the wisest move. I don't know, man. Like, I haven't. Newark maybe is one bright spot.
Yeah.
In terms of police reform, where there was a consent decree, there was a real effort to reform. Ras Baraka, of course, is like a radical guy. He's Amiri Baraka's son. They very notably didn't have the kinds of, like, police violence during the protests post George Floyd that other places do. So, like, are there places you can point to and say they're doing something right there? There are, but man, they feel few and far between.
Yeah. So as we're looking at this election, which I think a lot of people are sort of really invested in because, you know, there's not only social uprisings, there's COVID, there's employment, you know, people are struggling for work or money. And then we see people like Jeff Bezos being fine and making a shit ton of money in one single day. I'm wondering, where do you think the importance of police brutality is in a lot of voters' minds at this moment? Because I think it's one thing to say, like, in April and in March, certainly, like, I think it was really present, top of mind. But I think as we get closer to the election and, like, I just feel like the energy is sort of dipping a little bit. I'm wondering if people are sort of kind of forgetting the urgency with which we have to deal with police brutality.
I think it's a good question. I think these things do wax and wane in intensity. Mm-hmm. I do think that the pandemic is so ubiquitous and overwhelming. I mean, it's a once in a century catastrophe.
Yeah.
It is hard for that. I mean, that is the number one issue. It's just going to be. But I do think that, like, racial equity in a broader sense, like racial equity, is top of mind. In a way that I think it wasn't before the George Floyd's death, and then the movement of street protest and uprising. And I think that hasn't gone away. It's true that, like, it's very hard to sustain energy for street protest.
Yeah.
You know, those things kind of come and go, but the sort of consciousness there and the primacy of it, I think, has actually been kind of impressively enduring. And I think will have lasting effects. I mean, part of the problem, though, now is that there's so many crises piled atop each other.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, well, what do you try to solve first, you know? And not an easy question.
Yeah. What have you been, because I'm sure, like, you haven't traveled at all internationally, but I've been, watching the news.
We're not allowed to, Phoebe.
Yeah, I know, we're banned. America is on the
we literally
on the shit
can't
list.
Travel internationally. It's not. There's nowhere to go.
It's just funny because, we're always like, yeah, we rule. And the rest of the world is like, you're literal garbage right now. That we don't want you here. But
stay out. Don't come here.
What has surprised you the most about the sort of international reaction and the international sort of movement and embracing sort of Black Lives Matter, like, in a way that has never happened before, which I think is really exciting. And I think it's also forcing a lot of other countries and cities around the world to sort of take a look at their own sort of home and make sure they're taking care of things. I think a lot of times people like to think that race is an American issue and that everywhere else it's totally fine. And we don't know what's wrong with you guys and why you can't get it together. And now I think a lot of places are sort of seeing like, oh yeah, we have some mess to clean up too. And so I'm wondering, like, how you're thinking about it globally and what you're impressed by internationally.
I mean, it was striking to me how much those protests spread, and I think that, underlying all of that is the fact that, Europe particularly, America, for all of America's deep, deep flaws on race, has a story it tells itself about race. Like, that story is often, like, completely hypocritical and violated in the breach, but it has a self-mythology about race, right? That, like, here we all, like, American is like a creedal notion that, like, everyone can be it, and we all from different, and, like, that's, like, part of, now, again, that mythology is a mythology, right? A lot of times it's not true. But, like, Europe doesn't even have that. Like, to be Italian, I mean, I lived in Italy when I was studying. Like, to be Italian is to be from Italy in a certain way and, like, be of the land. So it's like, if you're a first generation child of a Nigerian immigrant to Bologna, like, the conception of what that Italianness means or what that Frenchness means, like, these are, and France actually has a very complicated story about this around the way that they dealt with Francophone colonized peoples, like, basically being like, you can be French if you're totally French and you leave behind everything else. But, like, all of these divisions, all these things that are sort of pressing down upon Western democracies about what nationhood means or being a member of a national community in a kind of genuinely multicultural age. Like, it's not like anyone has, like, figured it out.
Yeah.
Like, You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
look at the politics. Look at other multi-ethnic democracies right now. In India, there is like a right-wing demagogue in power who is aligned with like a proto-fascist paramilitary movement that does things like beats up Muslim people in the streets and like messes with mosques. Brazil has essentially a kind of like fascist sympathizing right-wing nationalist in power. Like, it's, you know, it's not like we have our specific problems that are specific to the particularity of slavery in specifically and its legacy. But it's not like building a fair, just, and equitable multiracial democracy is like easy and like everyone's done. Like, it's not, there's not a lot of great examples of it.
Yeah. So it's sort of, I mean, the fact that there's so many kind of insane people in power at the same time, to
Not
me,
good.
like, it's not good. And I also feel, I'm 35. And so I think maybe for me, this is probably the first time where I'm really feeling like, are all the stars aligning for this like great evil to just, I don't know. I just think the way that I think about politics here and also globally is just so different than how I thought about it when Obama was in the White House, and it still felt like, okay, there's some good people, there's some evil people, but on the whole, the planet is trying to work it out. But right now it just feels like it's just fascism is like leading the way. And I'm wondering why that is all coming together or seemingly coming together right now.
It's a great question that I don't have the answer to and is kind of above my pay grade. I mean, I think, what I would say is that like, there is a question. I think that the thing that you're identifying, which I think a lot of people also identify with, was a prior sense that there was some like forward trajectory towards like peace, justice, and equitable future, and that like we weren't gonna like, I don't know, like we're clearly not gonna like have another world war. It's like, I don't know, we might have another world war at this point. Like, I don't know, like I think a world war is a total possibility. I think that like having a bunch of like right-wing populist nationalists in power at the same time historically has not been great for peace. I think that whatever sense of kind of like maybe even kind of implicit security you had at some kind of forward path towards a better future is torn asunder, which I agree with.
Yeah.
And like, I think a lot of the source of that has to do with the fact that like we had kind of a model of the nation state. We had the post-World War II global order, which was absolutely messed up in a million different ways as people like romanticize it. Like, oh, NATO's so great. Like, well, it's a pretty complicated story about like all of these institutions, all of which have like genuine problems, but are also being like that order is coming apart.
Yeah.
And when a global order comes apart, you get a lot of chaos and violence. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. The question of like what the new order looks like, is there a more just and equitable order that we can all kind of collaboratively come together to make, particularly when we all have to solve climate change together? You know, that's a real question, but you know, I don't, there's a lot of unanswered questions right now.
Yeah. And so it makes me, I guess, to bring it back to the election, it makes me, I'm really concerned. And this is probably the first time voting that I've been truly like, I think with Gore, Bush, I was still in college at that point, and I was like, oh yeah, I guess there was some sort of trickery going on, but like, okay. But now I'm thoroughly concerned that, you know, of course, that votes are just gonna just disappear. That we just have no, like, there's like, this will be the election of my lifetime where it's like, it was not just and fair. There's no way it's going to be, you know?
So I am totally concerned with you. I think the question of whether we have a free and fair election is up for debate right now. I'm not worried about Bush just disappearing. What I think here's the most likely scenario, I think, is that the president uses every lever he has, including the Department of Justice or sympathetic secretaries of state who are Republicans in swing states, to go after absentee ballots, to try to rule as many of them, to try to sue to get certain ones not counted, to try to rule against as many of them as possible. I think that the strategy is very clear to me here is he's trying to make sure his people vote in person.
Yeah.
The Democrats, if they vote absentee, he could then leverage all of his campaign and the Department of Justice and maybe other entities to try to squash as many of those absentee ballots as possible.
Yeah.
Which is a frontal attack on democracy.
Yeah.
But I think it's probably the plan. But I don't think like votes are going to disappear. I think they're going to fight to disappear them, basically. And I think that like basically we just need to mobilize the non-Trump forces in this country, the broad non-Trump coalition to mobilize, and like everyone needs to get their ballots in early if they're going to absentee ballot vote. Vote in person if you feel comfortable, safe, and can do that. Particularly if there's early voting, so you can go to places that are not long lines and not super crowded.
Yeah.
And, you know, particularly if you're in a place with relatively low community transmission, like, I mean, I don't know how to tell people how to make their decisions for themselves, but like, it just needs to be a full effort.
Yeah. And I guess,
and then to be honest, street protest, like that, to me, the big lesson of the George Floyd thing is like, the only thing standing between us and tyranny is us. That's it. Like, if push comes to shove, if we are in a constitutional crisis, if we're at the precipice where someone is unjustly attempting to subvert the outcome of an election or to subvert the free and fair administration thereof, people in the streets, people power is what we have. That's it.
Yeah. I think I feel like I'm so just like heavy right now because I'm thinking about voting. I'm thinking about what I'm seeing on social media and how, you know, there isn't this sort of excitement around Joe Biden from a lot of Democrats. And, you know, I think there's a lot of flaws that both parties have. I think one of the biggest flaws that a lot of people in the Democratic Party have is, oh, if I'm not excited about this person, I'm just like not interested and not really understanding, well, the alternative is Trump. So you don't have to be super excited about Joe Biden, but you have to show up. You can't just
also,
sort of.
It's like, yeah, like, I mean, my feeling, someone had this meme the other day that was, I don't know whose quote it was originally of like, you know, voting is not like marriage. You're not waiting for the one. It's like public transportation. Like you're just trying to get somewhere. And if one bus route is not running, then you take another bus. Or like if the subway that you want to take is out of service, then like you take another subway to get you as close as you need to go to your destination.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think is like, look, voting is, you know, ideally it should be an hour of your life. Every you know, every few years, like if you're not enthusiastic, like doesn't matter. You're like, that's fine. You don't have to be you don't have to be enthusiastic. You should feel whatever you want. I do think that like it really does matter. As we have seen in the pandemic. I mean, we have tens of thousands of people that shouldn't be dead. I mean, we probably have like 100,000 and more people that shouldn't be dead. They should be alive right now. Like I know some of them. And that's governance. Like there are people that should be celebrating their birthdays, that should be with their kids, that should be watching their children graduate. Like, and we lost all those people needlessly. And we lost them needlessly because of the failure of governing. And that stuff matters. And it matters even like, you know, it matters. And I understand people's sense of like, whatever their level of enthusiasm is or their vision of it. But, you know, voting is just one small part of being an activated citizen. I also, though, at the same time, like I don't think it ends up being that effective to like hector people to vote.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's like, you know, whatever you want to do. Like,
Yeah.
I just think you should do this. Like,
yeah, I know, because it just feels like you're being lectured at or talked down
right.
to.
And I'm not sure
Yeah.
it just as a tactical matter, it's never clear to me that works.
Yeah. Yeah. Oy, oy, oy. Okay,
but I think saying to people like, here's why I'm voting.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's actually the way to do it. Like, is not to be like, it's just like, look, here's how I see this. Here's why I think it matters, and here's why I'm going to do this, because I think this is the situation we're in.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not about necessarily the perfect candidate. It can't always be that. You're not always going to get your favorite. So it's sometimes you just sort of have to look at like, okay, well, there's the other side of this is Trump. Do you want Trump? No. Do you want someone who doesn't care about COVID? No. Do you want someone who just is like, yeah, police officers, like, go into attack all these peaceful protesters, go for it, like, create this sort of hysteria and this fear? Do you want that? No. Then you have to vote for the other person who's not going to push that agenda. And you have to just be like, all right, well, I'm going to vote for Biden. I'm going to vote for Kamala. And I'm going to make sure that, like, they represent me in these next 4 years. But it is, I think some people, their idealism gets in the way of understanding that this is a true emergency, that if Trump has a second term, that is going to debilitate our country to such an extreme that we can't even fathom right now.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's just,
yes, it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
It's really we're in it.
Yeah. I want to, before I get to audience questions, I want us to say we had to talk about something uplifting and positive and light. Do you like Cardi B and Megan Thee Stallion's WAP?
That was such an amazing segue. Like, let's go upbeat. What are your views on a wet ass pussy?
I just want us to feel better, not just be sad and talking about how it's scary and intense right now. But yeah, that was quite the
love the
head
video.
snap.
I had a hilarious interaction. This is how much of a 40-year-old dad I am. Where I was like, I was talking to someone. I was like, I don't understand. Who's the white lady who comes in the middle? I was literally just I literally don't understand. There's just a white lady who comes in, and then she looks at a tiger or a cat, and then they're like, oh yeah, that's Jenner. She's some Jenner. She's like a Jenner Kardashian. And the person had to explain to me oh no, she's super famous. I was like, oh.
Who's the white lady that's walking through?
I don't get it.
Yeah, that is a bizarre I guess Cardi's friends with the Jenners, and I'm just like, what? Okay.
It is a weird moment, even if you're not an out of touch dad. Yeah. It is a weird moment in the video, objectively.
So you truly hadn't heard of Kylie Jenner until that moment? That's amazing.
No, I had heard of her. I knew she existed as a person. I just had no idea what she looked like. And so when I watched the video, I watched it a few times. An interesting video.
Interesting, right?
And then when she comes in the middle, I was just like, "What? Who is that? Where did she come from?" So when I asked my friend, he had to explain it to me.
That's amazing.
No, it's great stuff. Good fun. I think Megan's flow is amazing. Actually, I fell down an amazing rabbit hole the other day of have you ever looked at her old she sort of blew up on Instagram, and so I mean, I guess everyone knows that, but just going back and looking at old ciphers that she's in, which was super fun because she's incredible.
She's good. She's good. I hope that she is okay. I feel like people are really. This is a total.
Dude, that whole thing is so. I love how by the way, you were oh, let's take it to a lighter place, and now it's
But it's wild that
it's so messed up. It's so so messed up. And like,
Yeah.
people are attacking her on social media.
Yeah. Well, it's one of these things, and honestly, I know why it's happening, because this happens anytime, especially when it's a black woman, but when it's a black woman who does not look a specific way. Like if she looked like Zendaya and she was very fair skin, light skin, skinny, tiny, there wouldn't be that sort of like, oh, you faked it, you're a snitch. It would be like this outpour of like, oh my God, I can't believe this happened to you. But she is a bigger black woman, and there's this sort of, of treatment that, Serena Williams gets, where it's like, you're not a woman. You could fend for yourself. Like, you could fight this guy off. And it's like, what? She got shot. And she's now a snitch. And it's so wild that I'm like, if she was a light-skinned black woman or if she was a white woman, there's certainly no way. Like,
also, didn't she say in the video she didn't call the cops? Because like...
Well, the fact that she said it now, it makes it like she's a snitch. And it's like, she shouldn't have to pretend like she didn't get shot by someone. Yeah. It's nuts. This should have been the podcast. We should have just talked for an hour about this. No, I'm just kidding.
So messed up.
So messed up. Okay. So we just have a handful of questions for you. Okay. Let's start with this one. Okay. So this is from Allie in Philly. She writes, "Hey, Chris, how can we rebrand defunding the police to make it less scary to people?"
That's a great question.
I like that one.
I am not the person you would pay to come up with snappy messages. I think like this is not the solution from like a bumper sticker, but like the thing I think about is like reduce the scope of policing.
Yeah.
Paul Butler in his book on policing he's a law professor, and he's got a great thing about just like there are so many different parts of the criminal code misdemeanors that you could just replace with tickets. So like if you overstay a meter, right? Like you don't have a cop arresting you.
Yeah.
You just get a ticket for overstaying a meter. And there's ways about thinking about huge scopes of what we think of as the criminal code as just not being necessary for police to enforce. Someone said this the other day too about how there's so many things that police do. There's a sheriff in Louisiana who said in my 30 years, I would say that the overwhelming majority of calls I arrived at were not for things that were in the uniform crime report, like the crimes that get reported to the FBI for crime statistics, like most of the things I went to. And someone also pointed this out the other day for like car accidents. It's like, why do police take car accident reports?
Yeah.
Like, it's just natural to us. Like, oh, right, the cops come. It's like,
yeah,
someone else could do that.
Yeah.
I mean, in the case, I guess, of a hit and run, right, you have a different thing. But if like two people crash into each other, there's you need someone from the state to go sort of administer the paperwork or whatever. There's a lot of places I think where like, I think it's useful to think about reducing the scope. And I think that's in some ways like reducing the scope of policing is a little bit of an overlap between the kind of calls for defunding and the more like reformist part of it, which is like, what are reforms that reduce citizen police interactions, that reduce the scope of what police are tasked with? How do we come up with things that change policing that don't expand what they do, but reduce what they are tasked with doing?
That is, I'm also wondering too, and this isn't like, I don't have a solution, but I think, and I don't know this to be true, but I wonder if so many people get into police because they want to protect and serve. There is that sort of romanticized notion from literally every cop show and movie that's ever been made that they are the heroes. And so it might give people pause when you're saying defund the police, you're saying defunding the heroes. And so I'm wondering if we have to sort of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's precise. I mean, I think that's precisely the sort of uphill rhetorical battle, which doesn't mean, again, that it's not the right thing to call for. But I do think there's ways in which, that phrase, but I also think the phrase is sort of transforming over time. Like it's interesting to watch the sort of meaning and militancy of like Kaepernick's kneeling evolve over time to the point where like now the entire NBA kneels like for every, and it's like, it's fascinating, right? Like first, like the sort of first, it's like too out there, and then it's like everyone does it, So it'll be. I'm curious to see the sort of metamorphosis of what the meaning of that phrase and its political valence over time.
Ooh, the metamorphosis. Yes. Okay. This is from Anonymous. This is a great question. What can I say to people who don't think police brutality is inherently racist? Ooh, that's a rough one. Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of statistics, but I'm not sure that's first of all, one thing you can say is that like police brutality is not exclusive to African Americans or Black and brown people. Like it is actually there are white people who are abused by the police and who are jacked up by the police and the police and lie about it. Like that definitely exists, and it's a big country. So I think you can concede that as one place. Like it's not exclusive, but there are a bunch of statistics that show that like both policing centers disproportionately on Black people, specifically Black and brown communities, with specifically Black communities, and that uses of excessive force center. I mean, these are like, there are lots of cities that report this, and we see it. I mean, the thing I always think about is the marijuana statistic, which is that like Black and white people use marijuana at essentially identical levels, and that Black marijuana arrests are like 3 to 4 times what white arrests are.
Yeah.
So it's like, we just know that Black people are just policed more excessively than white people are. But yeah, I don't know. That's a tough one.
Yeah, because it's also like, I'm wondering if it is a conversation with like a family member, which, then you want to like take more time with, or if it's just I was going to say jackal, but it's some person like that you meet, I don't know, at Sweet Greens or whatever, where you're like, okay, this is a very bizarre scenario, but
just striking up a little convo while you're waiting for your beet salad.
But I think if it is with a family member, I think it is worth sort of having. I think you have to understand it's going to be more than one conversation.
Yeah.
Because if someone is not recognizing that police brutality is at least informed by racism, you really have to sort of work up.
Go a long way. Yes. That's right.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, people are so hung up on the word racist, which to me, I am still like, you're more upset about the word than the actual racist actions that are happening, which makes no sense to me. But I think that if you maybe don't want to use the word racist and just sort of talk about how it's discriminating and make it more palatable for someone to receive it, that could be a way to do it. But like you said, I think just arming yourself with stats and just maybe understanding that the person might not change their mind after you talk to them.
Yep.
You'll still believe what they believe, and just move forward and get that beet salad and go back home. Okay. This is a great one. This is from Danielle in Washington. She writes, how can people go about identifying their local police policies and gaps? Where can I start?
Well, first, I think you figure out your jurisdiction and what the police force is for it. So different places have different layers of police forces. If you're in a city, then that's clearly it'll be the city. Towns have police forces, and then there's state troopers, and then of course there's county forces, like county sheriffs, basically. So if you're in an urban area, it's going to be a local city's police force. Then the next thing to do is just like pull up the budget and see like what percentage of your city's budget is going towards it. There's a few different like basic things to look for. One is whether they make disciplinary records public, which New York resisted for years and just finally changed on that. If you have any kind of civilian complaint review board, any kind of like oversight board, of that's made up of civilians for the police. We have that in New York. There's one, I believe, in Chicago after it took a while to get one. Again, are those cure-alls? They are not.
Yeah.
There's some really interesting activism that's happening in some localities around police testimony, and whether prosecutors should be calling police who have already demonstrably like lied on stand. There's a lot of internal records coming out in certain places thanks to lawsuits showing that prosecutors know police that lie a lot and they still call them. That's a campaign that a lot of people are working on right now, which I think is really interesting. So I would just start with figuring out like who your police department is, what the budget is, and whether there's like any sort of civilian oversight.
Well, another one in the books, baby. This was a great conversation.
Great.
I am actually feeling lighter.
Are you going to play us out with WAP?
No, but thank you so much for joining me. This was so good. I mean, I'm sure I'll check in with you election night and be like, is America about to collapse? We'll find out, but
I hope not. No, I always enjoyed these. Let's do it again.
Okay, wowza. Chris and Clark. That was incredible, right, babe?
Full-blown education from your living room. Blown your bloody socks off.
People are listening to this while they're taking a dump. Let's be real.
That's probably true.
Yeah. Make sure it's 3-ply, guys. We messed up one time and got 1-ply. And
ooh. You get some nasty surprises.
Okay, you guys, seriously, this is a great episode. Thank you so much for listening. And I know this episode is long, so I want to get right into the Black-owned business that we're shouting out today. As you all know, we're an indie podcast. We get no advertising dollars. My voice.
Your voice went really weird then. I thought, she's trying to do an impression?
No, we get no advertising dollars, okay? Because we are independent. We're not with the man, okay?
Only one man in this business. Me.
Oh. Yeah. Yeah, you. Just kidding. Of course, you're the only man in this business. So instead of taking ad dollars, we really just want to highlight Black businesses that we love. And this is by far our favorite hot sauce we've ever had in our lives.
By a long way.
The Instagram handle is Shaquanda Will Feed You. It's really good. S as in Sam, HAQUAN as in Nancy, D as in David, A as in Apple, Will Feed You. It is fantastic. It is run by this incredible, like, juicy, joyful person. As I feel like I say juicy and joyful like Tracy Ellis Ross now.
Yeah.
But,
ever since that interview,
yes.
You've just been using that for every opportunity you can, yes.
But Andre Springer is a fantastic just person. This hot sauce is amazing. So go to his Instagram at Shaquanda Will Feed You. There's also a website, www.shaquandawillfeedyou.com. Order that freaking hot sauce. Let it change your life.
And as always, if you couldn't catch all of that, the links are in the description below.
Excuse me! Okay, credits time! Host, Phoebe Robinson. Producers, Phoebe Robinson and British Bake Off. Editor, British Bake Off. Intern, Sasha and Malia Obama.
We have interns? Wow.
We have 2.
Wow.
Sasha and Malia work remotely. Mishy B and Barack are like, what are you guys doing?
Yeah, it's like, they're at law school.
You guys totally kidding. We don't have interns. It's just the 2 of us. Okay, we will talk to you guys next week. Say bye, British Bake Off.
Bye, British Bake Off.
That was a kiss.